Today on Practical Church Planting, we're talking about something you do every week as a church, and that is gather together. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the optimal service times for your church.
Welcome back to Practical Church Planting, where in 15 minutes or less, we'll give you practical tips, advice, and encouragement to help you plant and grow healthy churches. My name is Brian Drosian. His name is Dylan Dodson, and today we're talking about the optimal service time, or times.
Yeah, time or times, depending on how many services you have.
Yes.
So this may not come as a surprise, but generally speaking, people still prefer to go to church services on a Sunday morning.
Right.
Now, you may be launching and planting and may not have the opportunity to do a Sunday morning because of space and that sort of thing, so maybe your evening. Briefly, we're going to talk about Sunday morning, but briefly, if that's in your boat, you could do Saturday evening or Sunday evening. Mm-hmm. Recommendations and things that I've seen that Sunday evening is better than Saturday evening if you can do it. And if you're going to do Sunday evening, a 5 o'clock, 4:35, 5:30 is probably around 5 o'clock is the best, most optimal time before dinner, before kids go to bed. You don't want to do it too early in the afternoon. So if you have to do evening between Saturday and Sunday, I would recommend Sunday around 5 o'clock. But that being said, optimal service times.
Yeah.
It depends on so we're going to talk about if you're doing 1, 2, or 3 services. If you're doing 4 or 5, you're probably not a church planter, and you should tell us. So here, traditionally people say because 11 o'clock has been like the main. That's when you have a service.
Yeah, that's the go-to.
Research has found, I've talked to a few guys that have done it and read a few things, that you may or may not know this, that between 9 and 11, or 9:30ish and 11, depending on what you read, that is actually the best time to have a service. And so let's talk about one service first, because if you only have one service, you can do your starting point at any point of that time. That's not a big deal. So between 9 and 11 o'clock is when you should start your service. A lot of people do 11. Traditionally, that has been the big thing, although I in my experience today, if you could pick any time, I probably would not go for it 11, just because it's a little bit later on a Sunday.
Yeah.
And people like stuff to do, especially if you have families with young kids, like they're already up. So I know 11 is kind of the traditional thing. I was a part of a church plant that we started at 11, and we did that for about a year or so, or maybe a little bit more, and then we switched. We moved it back. We moved it earlier because we kind of ran into that same thing. It just seemed kind of late for only one service, especially if you have people that are serving, setting up, and tearing down. They just have to be there a little bit later. And if you can do earlier, I would recommend it.
Yeah, I agree. I think 11 o'clock, especially when it comes to having kids, you have that kind of awkward period where everyone's up and maybe ready to go, but not going yet. And so, I agree. That's just kind of, it's too late to do anything beforehand, but not early enough to do much after.
So you kind of stuck at home.
Yeah.
And so like we did 10 o'clock. We found that to be a great time. And so you could do, again, between 9 and 11, 11 is still fine. Just would recommend, I would probably personally, anecdotally, would recommend a little bit earlier. Yeah. Especially if you have kids, you probably be like, 11's a little later. This is totally just a preference. For me, I think 10 o'clock is the best time for one service. I don't know I wouldn't necessarily do 9 if you don't have to, or 11. But that's for one service.
Yeah.
So just need to know that 9 to 11 is the most optimal time. I wouldn't do earlier. Definitely wouldn't do later if you have a decision.
Oh, yeah.
The question then is, what do you do when you go to 2 services, which is what we ran into? What often happens is, because 9 and 11 is the most optimal time, what you don't want to then do is when you have 2 services to have only one in that time and one not. Now, this kind of depends on how long your services are. Obviously, this is an American Western context. But let's say you go to 2 services. Having a service at 10 o'clock, and 8 and 10 o'clock, for example, would not be a good idea if research shows that most people would want to go between 9 and 11, because then you only have one service in between that optimal time, or 10 and 11:30. Again, you're missing out that optimal time. So if you have 2 services, depending on how long of the break you want to put between your services, you want to make sure they're both in that time spot between 9 and 11.
Yeah. Don't add kind of like a throwaway service. Like if you have a 10 o'clock, that's just a booming 10 o'clock, but we got to add one extra. I kind of get the temptation of like, let's just throw one extra in there just so the stragglers can go in there. Right. But then I think you end up actually.
And I think what you'll find is, obviously, typically you have one service a little bit bigger than the other. I think you'll find your 10 o'clock very, very heavy. And a side note too, when you go to multiple services, you want to change the service times for both of them.
Yes.
So you don't want to, let's say you have a service at 11, you're like, well, 9:30 and 11, because 11's already good, which I thought, you don't want to do that because nobody's going to go to the other service because they're so conditioned. You want to make everyone have to make a decision. That's just another thing when you go to 2 services. Maybe we'll do an episode on how to do that.
That's a good point.
But make sure it's a completely different time. So for us, for example, we did 45 minutes between services. We found that was too much time because our space isn't that big. It was kind of a dead period. So now we do 30 minutes. So we do 9:30 and 11. So we have both services in that optimal time slot. And so that's what you want to do as well. When you go to 2 services, make sure they're both in there. Now, what do you do when you go to 3 services? And this may be down the line for you, but it's just good for you to be thinking. What often happens, again, if 9 and 11 or 9:30 and 11 are the most optimal times, let's just say 9 through 11, what often happens is people will do like 8:30, 10, and 11:30.
Yeah.
And what have you done? You've then now still only have 1 service in that time slot.
Yep.
Now, when you have 3 services, you're not going to get all 3 in that time slot. But what you want to do is you want to have at least 2 in that time slot. So you could
Makes
do
sense.
8, 9:30, and 11, or something like that. I don't know, 7:30 if you really want to get up early, 9 and
I don't know about that.
and 10:30, right?
Yeah.
But I would honestly, I mean, that's so early, but I would take 7:30, 9, and 10:30 over 8, 10:30, and 11.
Yeah.
Even though that sounds crazy, because you're not getting stuff, you're not getting that time slot. So those are the most optimal times. And I would say too that it's okay. We have this in our mind that we can't like change our service times.
Yeah.
Like if something is not working, it's okay to adjust it. Yeah. I remember we launched our 2 services 4 or 5 months ago, and we did 9, 15, and 11. And after the first week, I was like, ooh, that was mostly my idea for those times, for 45 minutes. I was like, that's not good. And after the second week, I was like, yeah, this isn't not good. But I felt bad. I was like, well, we can't change it because we just did this. And I talked to Dave, one of the guys who's got a lot of ministry experience at our church, and he said something that you can apply to this or anything.
Yeah.
He said, oftentimes when church leadership notices a problem or notices something should be changed, everyone else in the church also knows it should be changed. And when you don't change it, it makes people wonder, do they not notice that there's a problem here?
Yeah.
And so when he said that, I was like, that is great. We are changing next week. Because it was true. Like, and everyone was like, yeah, that was a little bit of much. So literally the 3rd week of our 2 service transition, we switched from 9:15 to 11 to 9:30 and 11 to shorten the gap in between the service. And I would just say that too. You're like, well, maybe we just started, or maybe we just be honest and be like, hey, we think this time's going to look better. People probably be like, oh, I agree.
Yeah.
And so don't be afraid to change or make a decision, even though you've always done it a certain way. Because again, you exist, all of us, to fulfill the Great Commission and to reach people. And so you want to pick a time that you can do that if it's up to you, if you have a say in when you can actually meet.
And the good thing about if you end up having to push a service time back is the worst thing that's going to happen is someone shows up a little early.
Right.
Like pushing it, making it earlier is like a little bit of a different story, but if you have to push it back like we did, just push it back. There doesn't need to be a whole big debate about it.
Bought some breakfast stuff.
Right.
And
Just in case someone showed up.
no one really came early because we told everybody. I think we let people know pretty well. But again, those are the 9/11 is this is optimal service time. If you have to do afternoons, I would do Sunday before Saturday around 5 o'clock. We would recommend around 10 o'clock if you only have 1 service, 2 services. Keep them both in that 9 to 11 hour, 2 hour, whatever that is. And if you have 3 services, you still want to keep 2 in that time slot, because even people that have no experience with church at all, everyone just kind of knows it's like, if I'm interested in going, it's probably a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
And that's when they're looking to go somewhere.
Yeah.
So.
One thing I'll add is if you are doing 2 services, keeping them in that 9 to 11 time slot is, I think a lot of times we kind of get this thought of, I got to keep them far enough apart so that people have time to come and go. And if you have a setup team or you have to clean up whatever, you have enough time to do everything in between, which is kind of what we did, like you said,
right.
But then you end up leaving too much time in between, and then it looks like there's nobody here if someone comes early.
Right.
So you got to kind of walk that line of make sure they're far enough apart to where you can do things, but have a good amount of overlap.
And we've done an episode, I don't know the number, about how to create more engagement on a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
And so you want there to be engagement, especially when you go to 2 services and you have to refill and grow. You can lose some of that energy.
Yeah.
I even know of churches who, and they've got this down really well, they'll go an hour-ish and they'll have 15 minutes between services.
Yeah.
On purpose.
This is wild.
Because they're getting people in and out, they're creating energy and that sort of thing. And so you don't want to do too much. And because also it's like, you don't want people thinking, why is there 2 services? We could all fit in 1 service, because they might be thinking that.
Yeah, and if you have people that serve both, you have them just standing around for an hour with
Right.
nothing to do. It's pretty demoralizing.
I think a lot of times it's easy for us as staff and ministry leaders to choose what we want to do, and not what's best for the people. And so service times may be like, well, I like 11 because it gives me more time to prep my sermon and whatever. It's like, or I like to sleep in. I was like, this is not about your preference. It's about what's best for the church and for the congregation. And so that's why service times can be important.
Yep.
So that's a little bit for you about best optimal service times. If you have questions about anything you want us to talk about in a future episode, like service times or anything else,
Anything.
practicalplanting.com/questions. You can submit it there. Thanks for listening, and we'll be with you next time on Practical Church Planting. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Practical Church Planning. Whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or Practical Planning, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, make sure you like or subscribe or do whatever it's telling you to do or should do on that platform.
And hey, if you are so tired of looking at our ugly faces, but you're not tired of listening to our beautiful voices, then you can find our podcast if you just search Practical Church Planning on iTunes or Google Play. Make sure not to just find it, not just to listen, but to subscribe.
Make sure you subscribe. Brian, tell them to subscribe.
Subscribe.
See you next time.